A cruel man abandons his dog, but an unexpected miracle leaves everyone in shock. Bradley Wilkinson stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Chicago penthouse office, his reflection a perfect image of what Forbes magazine had dubbed the Ice King of Wall Street. His tailored suit remained pristine even after 14 hours of negotiations, not a single silver hair out of place. At 45, he had mastered the art of remaining untouchable, unreachable, a skill that had served him well in the cutthroat world of high finance. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching from. Stay with us. The city lights below twinkled like the numbers on his trading screens, each one representing another opportunity, another deal to be closed. His firm was on the verge of the biggest merger in Chicago's financial history, a deal that would either cement his legacy or become his greatest failure. Bradley checked his Patek Philippe watch, 9:45 p.m. Another late night at the office, but time was merely another variable in his carefully calculated existence. As he gathered his belongings, his phone buzzed with a message from Sarah, his ex-girlfriend. "It's been 3 years, Bradley. Max still waits by the door every night. He deserves better than this arrangement." The message sent an unexpected ripple through his carefully maintained composure. Max, the golden retriever he'd inherited when Sarah moved to London for her dream job. The dog had become an unwanted responsibility, a living reminder of the messiness of emotional attachments. The elevator ride down to the parking garage gave Bradley time to compose his usual deflective response, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the reflection of his tired eyes in the polished elevator doors, or maybe the weight of the upcoming merger was finally taking its toll. Instead of typing, he slipped the phone back into his pocket, the message unanswered. The drive home through Chicago's glittering streets was usually a time for Bradley to review the day's victories, to plan his next strategic moves. Tonight, however, his thoughts kept drifting to the golden retriever waiting at his penthouse. Max, with his endless patience and unconditional affection, represented everything Bradley had trained himself to avoid: emotional dependency, the need for connection, the vulnerability of caring. Upon entering his meticulously designed apartment, Bradley was greeted by the soft padding of paws on hardwood floors. Max appeared, his tail wagging with that same unwavering hope that Bradley found so unsettling. The dog's presence felt like a crack in the perfect facade he'd built around himself, a reminder of the messy, unpredictable nature of genuine connections. Bradley moved through his evening routine with mechanical precision, hanging up his suit, preparing a protein shake, reviewing tomorrow's agenda. All the while, Max followed him from room to room, maintaining a respectful distance, but never taking his eyes off his distant master. The dog's gentle presence felt increasingly suffocating, a constant reminder of the emotional entanglements Bradley had spent years avoiding. The upcoming merger weighed heavily on his mind. The Johnson and Mitchell deal was precarious at best, with shareholders growing increasingly nervous about the market volatility. One wrong move, one moment of distraction, and years of careful planning would crumble. Bradley couldn't afford any complications, any distractions, especially not the kind that came with 4 legs and soulful eyes. As he prepared for bed, Bradley's gaze fell on the dog bed in the corner of his room, an expensive, barely used piece of furniture since Max preferred to sleep by the door. The sight triggered a memory of Sarah's words from years ago. "You can't control everything, Bradley. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we never planned for." The thought of Sarah and her optimistic worldview brought a familiar tightness to his chest. She had been different from the other women in his life, genuine, unimpressed by his wealth, and frustratingly perceptive about his emotional walls. When she left for London, leaving Max behind had been her final attempt to teach Bradley about connection, about the importance of caring for something beyond himself. Standing in his bedroom, surrounded by the trappings of success but feeling increasingly hollow, Bradley made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events he could never have calculated. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of the most crucial week in his career, the final negotiations of the merger, the meetings that would determine his professional legacy. He couldn't afford any distractions, any loose ends. Max looked up at him with those trusting brown eyes. Unaware that his master was about to make a choice that would transform both their lives forever, Bradley reached for his phone, but instead of responding to Sarah's message, he began searching for something else, something that would finally free him from this last lingering attachment to his old life. The next morning dawned grey and cold, matching Bradley's mood as he prepared for what would be the most challenging week of his career. The Johnson & Mitchell merger negotiations had reached a critical phase, with international investors watching his every move. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, he could hear Max's nails clicking on the hardwood floor, a sound that had begun to feel like a ticking clock, counting down to an inevitable breakdown. The morning's first crisis came before he even left the apartment. His phone rang with news that the Asian markets had plummeted overnight, threatening to destabilize the entire merger. Bradley paced his living room, barking instructions to his team while Max watched him with those impossibly understanding eyes. The dog's steady gaze felt like an accusation, a reminder of everything Bradley had been trying to suppress. "No, listen carefully," Bradley snapped into his phone, his voice echoing off the minimalist walls of his apartment. "I don't care what Tokyo thinks. Get me those numbers recalculated before the morning meeting. We can't show any weakness." He ended the call and turned to find Max holding his favorite tennis ball, tail wagging hopefully. The contrast between the dog's simple desires and the complexity of his own world struck Bradley like a physical blow. At the office, things only got worse. The morning meeting turned into a battlefield of egos and fears, with board members questioning every aspect of the merger. Bradley maintained his infamous composure, but beneath the surface something was cracking. Between presentations, he found himself thinking about Max, about Sarah's message, about the growing weight of maintaining perfect control. "Mr. Wilkinson," his assistant Jennifer interrupted his thoughts. "The partners from Johnson & Mitchell are requesting additional guarantees. They're threatening to walk if we don't provide them by tomorrow morning." She paused, noting the unusual tension in her boss's normally impassive face. "Are you all right, sir? You seem—" "I'm fine," Bradley cut her off, straightening his posture. "Send me the documents. I'll review them tonight." But he wasn't fine. For the first time in his career, he felt his carefully constructed world beginning to splinter. The pressure of the merger, the constant presence of Max, the echoes of Sarah's words. It was all becoming too much. That evening, instead of heading straight home, Bradley drove aimlessly through Chicago's streets. The city lights blurred together as his mind raced through possibilities, calculations, escape routes. He found himself parking near Lake Michigan, staring out at the dark water that seemed to mirror the turmoil in his soul. His phone buzzed again, another crisis, another demand for his attention. The Johnson & Mitchell representatives were now insisting on a complete restructuring of the deal. The numbers he'd spent months perfecting were being questioned, pulled apart, dismissed. Bradley felt something inside him snap, a hairline fracture in his perfect facade. When he finally returned home, Max greeted him with the same unconditional warmth he always did, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside his master. Bradley watched the dog pad around the apartment, following his evening routine of checking his food bowl, bringing his favorite toy, and finally settling by the door, always watching, always waiting for a connection that Bradley couldn't give. The breaking point came when Max gently placed his head on Bradley's knee as he sat reviewing the merger documents. That simple gesture of affection, of trust, became unbearable. In that moment, Bradley saw Max as the embodiment of everything that threatened his control: emotion, dependency, the messy reality of genuine connection. Drawing on the same cold efficiency that had made him successful, Bradley began to formulate a plan. He would solve this problem like he solved everything else, decisively, permanently. The thought of what he was considering should have filled him with guilt, but instead, he felt a familiar sense of calm settling over him. This was just another transaction, another loose end to tie up. As midnight approached, Bradley made 2 calls. The first was to his office, instructing them to prepare for an early morning strategy session. The second was to cancel his dog walker's services. Max watched him from his spot by the door, his brown eyes reflecting a trust that Bradley was about to betray in ways he couldn't yet admit to himself. Standing in his kitchen, Bradley gripped the edge of his marble countertop, his knuckles white with tension. Tomorrow would change everything. The merger, his life, his last connection to anything resembling real emotion. He looked at Max one last time, the dog's unwavering loyalty suddenly feeling like an unbearable burden. In the darkness of his apartment, surrounded by the symbols of his success, Bradley Wilkinson made a decision that would set in motion events far beyond his ability to control or calculate. The following day emerged under heavy clouds, nature itself seeming to mirror the darkness in Bradley's heart. He had barely slept, his mind cycling through spreadsheets, market projections, and the weight of what he was about to do. Max had spent the night in his usual spot by the door, unaware that this morning would be different from all the others. Bradley moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision, but something had shifted in his demeanor. His hands trembled slightly as he knotted his tie, a detail that would have infuriated him on any other day. Today, however, his mind was focused on a different kind of precision, the execution of a plan that would free him from what he saw as his last emotional burden. "Come on, Max," he called, his voice steadier than he felt. "We're going for a ride." The golden retriever's tail wagged eagerly. Car rides were a rare treat. Bradley watched as Max bounded toward the elevator, feeling a strange tightness in his chest that he refused to acknowledge as guilt. The drive out of Chicago was silent, except for Max's occasional happy pants from the back seat. Bradley had chosen his route carefully, avoiding the major highways and their surveillance cameras. He drove west, past the suburbs where cookie-cutter houses gave way to scattered farms and empty fields. Each mile marker seemed to whisper accusations he couldn't quite silence. His phone buzzed constantly. The merger crisis was escalating. Johnson and Mitchell's representatives were threatening to pull out entirely, citing concerns about market stability. Bradley ignored the calls, knowing that for this plan to work, he needed to be unreachable for the next few hours. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was finally disconnecting, but not in the way Sarah had always encouraged. 2 hours outside the city, Bradley found what he was looking for, a stretch of rural road bordered by open fields and patches of woodland. He pulled over, his luxury car looking absurdly out of place against the pastoral backdrop. Max's tail thumped against the seat, anticipating an adventure. "Out you go," Bradley commanded, opening the back door. Max jumped out eagerly, immediately beginning to explore the new surroundings with his nose. Bradley watched him, his face an impassive mask that had served him well through countless tough negotiations. This was just another transaction, he told himself, a necessary adjustment to maintain optimal performance. But as he stood there, watching Max investigate a cluster of wildflowers with pure joy, something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced. Max, as a puppy, tumbling around his apartment, bringing chaos and laughter into his perfectly ordered world. Sarah's voice echoed in his mind. "He'll teach you more about love than any business deal ever could." Bradley's phone vibrated again, pulling him back to reality. 12 missed calls from the office. The merger was probably imploding. Good, he thought. The chaos at work would provide the perfect cover for what he was about to do. No one would question why he'd been unreachable for a few hours on such a crucial day. "Max," he called sharply, making the dog look up from his exploration. Those brown eyes met his, filled with absolute trust. Bradley felt something crack inside him, a hairline fracture in the walls he'd built around his heart. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand gripping his car door so hard his knuckles turned white. But then another call came through, and the moment shattered. Bradley got into his car, his movements swift and decisive. He refused to look in the rearview mirror as he pulled away, leaving Max standing alone by the side of the road. The dog's confused bark echoed through the countryside, following his car like a ghost. The drive back to Chicago was a blur. Bradley switched his phone to airplane mode, unable to deal with either work crisis or his own thoughts. The empty back seat seemed to grow larger with each mile, becoming a void that threatened to swallow him whole. He tried to focus on the merger, on the millions at stake, on the career he'd spent decades building. But all he could hear was the sound of Max's nails on his hardwood floors, a phantom echo of what he'd just destroyed. By the time he reached his office building, the sky had darkened with approaching storms. Bradley straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and stepped into the elevator with his usual air of authority. No one who saw him would guess what he'd just done. But as he caught his reflection in the elevator's polished doors, he saw something different in his own eyes, a shadow he'd never noticed before, a cost of control he was only beginning to understand. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings and market projections, but something had fundamentally changed in Bradley's world. His apartment, once a sanctuary of order and control, now felt hauntingly empty. The absence of Max's gentle presence created a silence that seemed to pulse with accusation. Even the simple act of coming home had become an exercise in avoiding memories. The empty water bowl he couldn't bring himself to move, the tennis ball still lying in the corner of his living room. At work, the Johnson & Mitchell merger was teetering on the edge of collapse. Bradley found himself making uncharacteristic mistakes, missing crucial details that he would have caught easily just days before. During a particularly tense video conference, he lost his train of thought mid-presentation when he thought he heard a dog barking outside his office window, 18 floors up. "Mr. Wilkinson," one of the Johnson & Mitchell executives interrupted, "these projections seem unusually optimistic given the current market volatility. Are you certain about these numbers?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Bradley Wilkinson was never uncertain about numbers. It was his trademark, his claim to fame. "The numbers," Bradley started, then paused, his usual confidence wavering. "The numbers will be revised and sent to you by tomorrow morning." He ended the call abruptly, something he'd never done before. His assistant Jennifer stood in the doorway, concern evident on her face. "Sir, are you feeling all right? You seem different since Monday." Her words carried a weight that made Bradley's shoulders tense. Monday, the day he'd driven out of Chicago with Max, returning alone. "I'm fine," he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Just make sure those revised projections are on my desk first thing tomorrow." Jennifer nodded and retreated, but not before giving him one last worried look. That night, unable to face the emptiness of his apartment, Bradley worked late into the evening. The office lights created shadows that seemed to move like a wagging tail in his peripheral vision. Every sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the distant ding of the elevator, the rustle of papers, seemed to carry echoes of Max's presence. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Max isn't at your apartment. The dog walker called me. Bradley, what did you do?" He stared at the message until his screen went dark, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal the truth of his actions. As he finally drove home through Chicago's glittering nightscape, Bradley found himself taking a detour that led him past the city's animal shelters. He told himself it was just a coincidence, that he was merely avoiding traffic, but deep down, he knew better. At a red light, he caught sight of a woman walking a golden retriever that looked nothing like Max, yet the sight made his heart race. The woman was wearing scrubs, obviously returning home from a late hospital shift. There was something in the way she interacted with the dog, a genuine connection, an easiness that Bradley had never managed to achieve with Max. As he watched, she knelt down to face the dog at eye level, speaking to it as if it were the most important being in her world. The light turned green, but Bradley remained frozen, watching the pair disappear around a corner. The cars behind him honked impatiently, their noise jolting him back to reality. He drove home in a daze, his mind replaying the image of the woman and her dog, contrasting it with his own failed attempt at connection. That night, sleep eluded him. Bradley lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling as memories of Max played through his mind like an accusing film reel. The dog's patient presence, his unwavering loyalty, his simple joy at Bradley's return each day, all of it had been too much to handle, too pure for someone who had built his life around avoiding genuine connections. In the darkness of his bedroom, Bradley's phone lit up with another message from Sarah. This time, he couldn't ignore it. His hands trembling slightly, he opened the message. "I trusted you to take care of him." He trusted you. What kind of person throws away trust like that? The question hit him like a physical blow. For the first time in his career, Bradley found himself facing a problem that couldn't be solved with spreadsheets or market analysis. The emptiness in his apartment seemed to grow, threatening to swallow him whole. Even the impressive view of Chicago's skyline from his penthouse windows felt hollow, the city lights blurring together as he realized that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. As dawn approached, Bradley made a decision that would have been unthinkable just days ago. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he'd never thought he'd need. A private investigator recommended by one of his less scrupulous clients. If there was even a chance that Max was still out there, he had to know. The merger, his reputation, everything else could wait. For the first time in his life, Bradley Wilkinson was about to pursue something more valuable than profit margins and market shares. Jenna Collins had always believed that every abandoned animal carried a story in its eyes. After 12 years as an ER nurse and 5 years running her unofficial animal rescue operation, she'd become an expert at reading those stories. But there was something different about the golden retriever she'd found wandering near Peterson Park, something that spoke of a deeper wound than simple abandonment. "You're special, aren't you?" she whispered to Max. Watching him stare out her apartment window at the Chicago skyline, it had been 3 days since she'd found him, well-groomed and wearing an expensive collar, but with no tags or microchip. Everything about him suggested a privileged background. His perfect teeth, his carefully maintained coat, even the way he sat with an almost aristocratic posture. Yet there was a sadness in his eyes that Jenna recognized all too well. As she prepared for her night shift at Chicago Memorial, she found herself drawn to the window where Max kept his vigil. In her years of rescue work, she'd never seen a dog so intently focused on watching the world outside, as if waiting for someone who might never return. "Someone really did a number on you, didn't they?" Jenna spoke softly, kneeling beside him. Max turned to look at her, and in that moment, she saw a reflection of her own past pain. 5 years ago, she'd lost her younger sister to a prolonged illness, an experience that had transformed her approach to both her nursing career and her work with animals. Every life saved, human or animal, felt like a small victory against the helplessness she'd felt then. Her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. They were short-staffed again, asking if she could come in early. Jenna sighed, running her fingers through her auburn hair. The extra hours would help fund her rescue work, but leaving Max alone still felt wrong. He'd only been with her a few days, yet she'd already noticed his anxiety whenever she prepared to leave. "I'll be back before you know it," she promised, gathering her things. Max followed her to the door, his tail wagging hopefully. "No, sweetie, you need to stay here. I'll bring you a treat from the cafeteria." The dog's expression as she closed the door made her heart ache. It was the look of someone who'd learned to expect abandonment. At the hospital, Jenna moved through her shift with her usual efficiency, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Max. Between treating patients, she found herself researching golden retriever behavior patterns on her phone, trying to understand what might have led to his abandonment. His manners were impeccable, his training evident in every movement. This was no ordinary stray. "Collins, we need you in trauma too," a colleague called out, snapping her back to reality. As she rushed to assist with an incoming emergency, Jenna pushed thoughts of Max aside. But even in the controlled chaos of the ER, she couldn't shake the feeling that the universe had brought him to her for a reason. During her break, Jenna sat in the hospital's small garden, scrolling through local lost dog reports. Nothing matched Max's description, which only deepened the mystery. Who would abandon such a well-trained, beautiful dog? The question nagged at her, professional instincts telling her there was more to this story than simple neglect. A movement caught her eye. A man in an expensive suit hurrying past the garden, his posture radiating stress and authority. Something about him reminded her of Max's regal bearing, that same air of privilege and careful control. For a moment, Jenna wondered about the kind of person who could abandon a dog like Max, someone successful perhaps, too busy for genuine connections, too focused on maintaining perfect control. Returning home after her shift, Jenna found Max exactly where she'd left him, watching the door. His tail wagged at her entrance, but his eyes quickly returned to their vigilant observation of the outside world. She sat beside him on the floor, still in her scrubs, sharing the muffin she'd brought from the hospital cafeteria. "You know," she said, watching him delicately take his half of the muffin, "sometimes the best things in life come from the biggest heartbreaks." She thought of her sister, of how that loss had led her to rescue work, to moments like this. Maybe you and I were meant to find each other. That night, as Chicago's lights twinkled outside her modest apartment, Jenna made a decision. She would do more than just foster Max. She would heal him, help him trust again. Whatever his story was, wherever he had come from, he deserved a chance at happiness. As she prepared for bed, Max finally left his post by the window, choosing instead to lie near her bedroom door. It was a small change, but to Jenna, it felt like progress. In her line of work, both with humans and animals, she'd learned that healing rarely followed a straight path. Sometimes it required patience, understanding, and the willingness to remain present through the darkest moments. What she didn't know was that her path and Max's were about to intersect with another's, someone whose own journey of healing was just beginning, whether he realized it or not. The private investigator's office was nothing like the sleek corporate environments Bradley was used to. Sean Murphy's workspace was cluttered with coffee cups and old case files, the window blinds permanently tilted against the Chicago sun. Bradley sat stiffly in a chair that had seen better days, his Italian suit looking out of place among the worn furniture. "So, let me get this straight," Murphy said, leaning back in his creaking chair. "You want me to find a golden retriever that you—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Lost track of about a week ago." The investigator's eyes, sharp despite his disheveled appearance, studied Bradley's face. "Money is no object," Bradley replied, his voice maintaining its usual professional tone despite the unusual circumstances. The merger was still hanging by a thread, his office was in chaos, but here he sat, spending his morning searching for a dog he had deliberately abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on him. Murphy nodded, jotting down notes. Golden retriever, male, approximately 5 years old, wearing a brown leather collar. He looked up. Any distinguishing marks? Behaviors. Bradley found himself describing things he hadn't realized he'd noticed. The way Max tilted his head when confused, the small white patch on his chest, his habit of carrying around a specific tennis ball. As Bradley spoke, Murphy's expression shifted from skeptical to intrigued. "You know," the investigator said carefully, "most people who lose their dogs don't know these kinds of details. Makes me wonder why someone who paid such close attention would lose track of their pet in the first place." The comment hit Bradley like a slap. He stood abruptly, straightening his jacket. "Your job is to find him, not analyze the situation. Call me when you have something concrete." He placed his business card on Murphy's desk and turned to leave. "Mr. Wilkinson," Murphy called after him, "finding a dog in Chicago isn't like finding a person. They don't use credit cards or cell phones. This could take time." Bradley paused at the door, his hand tightening on the handle. Time was the one thing he didn't have, with the merger falling apart and his career hanging in the balance. Back at his office, Bradley found himself unable to focus on the crisis at hand. The Johnson and Mitchell representatives were demanding another emergency meeting, but his mind kept wandering to Max. During a crucial conference call, he caught himself staring at a photo on his phone, Max asleep in a patch of sunlight on his apartment floor, taken months ago and never deleted. "Mr. Wilkinson," Jennifer's voice snapped him back to reality. "The board is waiting for your response about the revised terms." Bradley looked up to find all eyes on him, waiting for the decisive leadership he was known for. Instead, he felt paralyzed, caught between the person he'd been and someone he was becoming against his will. Meanwhile, across town, Jenna was discovering new layers to Max's personality. She'd started taking him to the small dog park near her apartment, watching as he politely but firmly avoided other dogs, preferring to stay close to her. His behavior spoke of expensive training, but also of something else, a deep-seated need for security. "He's not your typical stray," commented Dr. Martinez, Jenna's friend and local veterinarian, during Max's checkup. "Everything about him, his dental work, his vaccinations, even the way he responds to commands, suggests he came from money." Jenna nodded, scratching behind Max's ears as he sat perfectly still for his examination. "I just can't understand how someone could invest so much in a dog and then just..." Jenna's voice trailed off as Max leaned against her leg, seeking reassurance. "Doctor." Martinez gave her a knowing look. "You're getting attached, aren't you?" Before Jenna could respond, her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Another emergency shift needed covering. The constant demands of her job made it difficult to provide the stability Max needed, but somehow they were making it work. She'd noticed him starting to relax more, his vigilant window-watching sessions growing shorter. That evening, as Chicago's summer storm clouds gathered overhead, Bradley sat in his empty apartment, Murphy's latest report in his hands. The investigator had traced Max's movement through several neighborhoods, following sightings and security camera footage. The trail led to the north side of the city, where it went cold near Peterson Park. Thunder rumbled outside as Bradley studied the map Murphy had provided, his finger tracing possible routes. The merger documents that needed his attention lay forgotten on his desk. For the first time in his career, the numbers that had always been his refuge held no comfort. Instead, his mind was filled with calculations of a different sort. How far could a dog travel in a week? How long could Max survive on the streets? As rain began to pelt his window, Bradley's phone lit up with another message from Sarah. "I know what you did." "How could you?" The accusation in her words matched the storm's intensity. Bradley stood at his window, watching lightning illuminate the city skyline. In the reflection, he barely recognized himself. The perfectly controlled exterior was cracking, revealing something raw and unfamiliar beneath. Across the city, Jenna sat on her couch with Max's head in her lap, both of them watching the storm. The dog trembled slightly at each thunderclap, and she found herself humming softly, the same lullaby she used to sing to her sister during hospital nights. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." Neither Jenna nor Bradley knew it yet, but their paths were about to converge. Murphy's investigation was leading him closer to Peterson Park, closer to Jenna's apartment, closer to a confrontation that would force both humans to question everything they believed about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of responsibility. As the storm raged over Chicago, three hearts beat in uncertain rhythm, each sensing that something momentous was approaching with the fury of the summer storm. The morning Murphy called with news, Bradley was in the middle of what could have been the most important meeting of his career. The Johnson & Mitchell merger was hanging by a thread, with international investors threatening to pull out entirely. But when his phone buzzed with the investigator's number, Bradley did something unprecedented. He excused himself from the meeting. "I found him," Murphy said without preamble. "Your golden retriever is living with a nurse in an apartment near Peterson Park. Name's Jenna Collins." Bradley's hand tightened on his phone as Murphy continued. "She's been taking good care of him. Found him wandering around the park about 2 weeks ago." The relief Bradley felt was immediately complicated by a new emotion: jealousy. Someone else was caring for Max, showing him the affection that Bradley had never managed to provide. "Send me the address," he demanded, already reaching for his car keys. "Wilkinson," Murphy's voice held a warning, "think carefully about how you handle this. This Collins woman, she's well known in the neighborhood for helping strays. She works at Chicago Memorial, spends her free time rescuing animals. She's not going to just hand over a dog she thinks was abandoned." Bradley barely heard the warning. His world, which had been spiraling out of control since abandoning Max, suddenly had a focal point again. He could fix this. He could reclaim what he'd thrown away. The fact that it might not be that simple never occurred to him. Meanwhile, Jenna was experiencing a breakthrough with Max. For the first time since she'd found him, he'd slept through the night without watching the door. She'd woken to find him curled up on his bed in the corner of her room, looking more peaceful than she'd ever seen him. "You're finally feeling at home, aren't you?" she whispered, kneeling to ruffle his ears. Max's tail thumped against the floor, his eyes full of trust that made her heart ache. Whatever his past held, whatever had led to his abandonment, he was healing. That morning, as she prepared for her shift at the hospital, Jenna didn't notice the expensive black car parked across the street from her apartment building. She didn't see Bradley Wilkinson watching from behind tinted windows as she left for work, Max's face pressed against her apartment window. Bradley sat in his car, his usual confidence wavering. Through the window of Jenna's second-floor apartment, he could see Max, healthy, well cared for, but somehow different. The dog's posture had changed. He seemed more relaxed, more natural than he'd ever been in Bradley's penthouse. His phone buzzed again. Jennifer, his assistant, reminding him about the emergency board meeting scheduled for the afternoon. The merger was imploding. His career was at risk, but for the first time in his life, Bradley Wilkinson wasn't thinking about numbers or market shares. Inside her apartment, Max suddenly perked up, his nose twitching. Something about the scent drifting up from the street below caught his attention. He moved away from his usual spot by the window, pacing anxiously around the apartment. Some deep memory had been triggered, bringing with it a confusion of emotions the dog couldn't process. Bradley finally stepped out of his car, his designer shoes clicking against the sidewalk as he approached the building's entrance. The neighborhood was a far cry from his usual haunts, modest but well-maintained, with small businesses and actual neighbors who seemed to know each other. The building's security was minimal compared to his luxury high-rise. Within minutes, he found himself standing outside Jenna's door, his hand raised to knock. Through the door, he could hear Max moving around, could almost feel the dog's presence on the other side, but before his knuckles could touch the wood, Bradley froze. What right did he have to disrupt this new life Max had found? The dog's face in the window had shown a contentment that Bradley had never managed to provide. His hand dropped to his side as the weight of his past actions pressed down on him. As he stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a neighbor emerged from the apartment across the hall. The elderly woman took one look at Bradley in his expensive suit and narrowed her eyes. "Are you looking for Jenna?" she asked, protective instinct evident in her voice. "She's at work. At the hospital." The hospital. Chicago Memorial. Bradley nodded his thanks and retreated, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Back in his car, he pulled out his phone and began researching Chicago Memorial's visiting hours, staff schedules, anything that might help him plan his next move. What he didn't know was that Jenna had already begun her own investigation. Max's expensive collar and perfect training had sparked her curiosity, and she'd started asking questions around the neighborhood. The same tight-knit community that had noticed Bradley's presence would soon tell her about the strange man in the expensive suit who'd been watching her building. As the day progressed, both Bradley and Jenna went about their routines, unaware that they were moving inexorably toward a confrontation that would force them both to question everything they believed about love, responsibility, and the true meaning of ownership. In his lonely apartment by the window, Max continued to pace, sensing the approaching collision of the two worlds he'd known, the cold precision of his past and the warm acceptance of his present. The Chicago Memorial Hospital's emergency department was chaos in motion, a carefully orchestrated dance of medical professionals responding to the city's constant stream of crises. Jenna moved through it with practiced ease, her mind partially focused on her patients and partially on the mysterious man who'd been seen outside her apartment building. "Collins," a colleague called out. "There's someone asking for you at the front desk. Says it's important." Jenna glanced at the clock, 2 hours left in her shift. She wasn't expecting anyone, and something about the situation made her uneasy. When she reached the reception area, she immediately spotted him. Even in a hospital waiting room, Bradley Wilkinson commanded attention. His tailored suit and perfect posture seemed to create an invisible barrier between him and the usual emergency room crowd. "Miss Collins," he said, stepping forward with the confidence of someone used to controlling every situation. "My name is Bradley Wilkinson. I believe you have something that belongs to me." Jenna felt her protective instincts flare. She'd dealt with enough abandoned animals to recognize the type, wealthy people who treated pets like accessories, discarding them when they became inconvenient. "If you're talking about Max," she replied, keeping her voice professional but firm. "He's not a thing that belongs to anyone." Bradley's carefully maintained composure flickered. "You don't understand. There were circumstances, complications. I've come to rectify the situation." He reached into his jacket, probably for his wallet, but Jenna cut him off with a raised hand. "Mr. Wilkinson, I'm in the middle of my shift. If you want to discuss Max, we can do it when I'm finished. 2 hours." She turned to leave, then paused. "And just so we're clear, Max isn't for sale." For the first time in his career, Bradley Wilkinson found himself completely off balance. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. Money always smoothed the way, opened doors, solved problems. But the look in Jenna's eyes told him this would be different. 2 hours later, they sat in the hospital's small courtyard garden. The summer evening was settling over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Bradley had spent the waiting time fielding increasingly panicked calls about the merger, but now his phone lay silent in his pocket. He was abandoned, Jenna began without preamble, left on the side of the road like garbage. Do you know what that does to a dog? Especially one as sensitive and loyal as Max. Her voice carried years of experience with similar cases, each one having left its mark on her heart. Bradley stared at his perfectly polished shoes, unable to meet her gaze. "I made a mistake," he said quietly, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "The merger, the pressure. I wasn't thinking clearly." "A mistake?" Jenna's voice rose slightly. "A mistake is forgetting to feed your pet on time. Abandoning them on a remote road is a choice, a cruel, deliberate choice." She studied his face, seeing something beneath the polished exterior, a crack in the armor of a man who'd spent his life avoiding emotional connections. "I want to make it right," Bradley insisted, finally looking up. "Whatever it costs, I'll pay for everything he needs. Set up a trust fund for his care." "Stop," Jenna interrupted. "This isn't about money. This is about trust. Max spent weeks watching my door, waiting for someone who threw him away. He's just starting to heal, to trust again. And now you want to what? Write a check and take him back to your perfect life where he was just another inconvenience." The truth in her words hit Bradley like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind. Max waiting patiently by his door each night, bringing his tennis ball with eternal hope, offering unconditional love that Bradley had never known how to accept. "You don't understand," he tried again, his voice losing its usual authority. "Jamil, I've lost everything else. The merger is failing, my career is hanging by a thread. Max is the only thing I have left that matters." "That's exactly the problem," Jenna replied softly. "You only realized he mattered after you lost him. That's not love, Mr. Wilkinson. That's regret." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled only by the distant sounds of the city and the hospital. In that moment, Bradley saw himself through Jenna's eyes, a man who had everything society valued and nothing that truly mattered. "Come home with me," Jenna said finally. "See him. But I warn you, if your presence upsets him, if I see any sign that this is causing him distress, you leave. Immediately. And don't come back." Bradley nodded, understanding that this was more than he deserved but less than he'd hoped for. As they walked to their cars, he noticed how different Jenna was from the powerful people he usually dealt with. There was a genuine warmth to her, an authenticity that made his usual world of corporate power plays seem hollow and artificial. What neither of them knew as they drove through Chicago's twilight streets was that this evening would change both their lives forever. The meeting between Bradley and Max would not go as either of them expected, setting in motion events that would force them all, man, woman, and dog, to redefine their understanding of love, loyalty, and redemption. The climb to Jenna's second-floor apartment felt like the longest journey of Bradley's life. Each step brought him closer to a moment of truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Jenna walked slightly ahead, her keys jingling softly in her hand, the sound somehow both mundane and momentous. "Wait here," she instructed as they reached her door. "Let me check on him first." Bradley nodded, his throat too tight for words. Through the door, he could hear Max's familiar movement, the soft padding of paws on hardwood floors that had once been the soundtrack to his own evenings. Jenna slipped inside, leaving Bradley alone in the hallway. He could hear her gentle voice through the door, speaking to Max in tones he'd never managed to use himself. "Hey, sweetie. There's someone here to see you. Are you ready for a visitor?" When the door finally opened again, Bradley's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. Max stood beside Jenna, his tail wagging slightly. But something was different. The dog's posture was relaxed, confident, a stark contrast to the anxious, eager to please companion he'd been in Bradley's apartment. "Max," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking on that single syllable. The dog's ears perked up at the sound, recognition flickering in his brown eyes. For a moment, no one moved. Then Max did something that broke Bradley's heart. He stepped behind Jenna, seeking reassurance from her presence. "Come in," Jenna said softly, her own heart aching at the scene unfolding before her. Her apartment was modest compared to what Bradley was used to, but it was warm and lived in. Dog toys were scattered about, throw blankets draped over comfortable furniture, and photographs of rescued animals covered one wall, a shrine to second chances. Bradley entered slowly, every movement calculated to appear non-threatening. His eyes never left Max, taking in the changes in his former companion. The dog looked healthy, his coat gleaming, but it was more than physical well-being. There was a peace about him that Bradley had never seen before. "He's different here," Bradley observed, his voice barely above a whisper. He sank into an offered chair, his usual perfect posture abandoned. Max watched him from his spot near Jenna, his tail moving in uncertain rhythm. "He's not different," Jenna corrected gently. "He's just allowed to be himself here. Dogs don't need premium kibble and designer collars, Mr. Wilkinson. They need love, consistency, and the freedom to express their emotions without fear of disappointing anyone." The words struck Bradley like physical blows, each one illuminating a truth he'd been running from. He thought of all the times he'd ignored Max's attempts at connection, too focused on emails or phone calls to acknowledge the simple gift of unconditional love being offered. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Max began to move. He took a tentative step toward Bradley, then another. Jenna held her breath, ready to intervene if needed. But something in the dog's body language told her to wait. Max approached his former owner, his nose twitching as he took in the familiar scent. Bradley remained perfectly still, afraid that the slightest movement might shatter this fragile moment. When Max finally came within reach, Bradley slowly extended his hand, palm up, not demanding, just offering. The dog sniffed his hand, memories clearly stirring behind those expressive eyes. Then, in a moment that would forever change Bradley Wilkinson's understanding of forgiveness, Max gently placed his head in Bradley's palm. The touch broke something in Bradley. Tears he'd held back through countless business deals and personal losses finally broke free. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words meant for both Max and Jenna. "I'm so sorry." Jenna watched as Max moved closer, allowing Bradley to wrap his arms around him in an embrace that spoke of genuine remorse and desperate love. But she also noticed that every few moments, Max would look back at her, seeking reassurance that everything was okay. "So he's happy here," Bradley said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Happier than he ever was with me." The admission cost him dearly, but for the first time in his life, Bradley Wilkinson was choosing truth over pride. The moment was interrupted by Bradley's phone buzzing insistently in his pocket, another crisis with the merger, another demand for his attention. But this time, something had shifted. The choice between business and genuine connection no longer seemed impossible to make. As the summer evening settled over Chicago, 3 hearts beat in uncertain rhythm in that modest apartment. None of them knew it yet, but this night would mark the beginning of a different kind of merger, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, forgiveness, and the families we choose. Thunder rumbled in the distance, promising another Chicago storm. But inside Jenna's apartment, something was breaking and healing all at once. The journey that had begun with an act of abandonment was about to take an unexpected turn, leading all of them toward a future none of them could have imagined. 6 months later, Chicago's first snow of the winter dusted the city in white. Bradley Wilkinson stood at a window, but it wasn't the familiar view from his penthouse office. Instead, he watched Max playing in the snow-covered yard of Max's Haven, the animal shelter he and Jenna had opened together on the city's north side. The merger had failed spectacularly. Bradley's choice to prioritize his evening with Max over the emergency board meeting had been the final straw for the investors. But standing there watching Max teach a newly rescued golden retriever how to catch snowflakes, Bradley couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. "The contractor just called," Jenna's voice came from behind him. The new wing should be ready by spring. She joined him at the window, their shoulders touching comfortably. The past months had transformed their initial antagonism into something neither of them had expected. A partnership built on shared purpose and growing trust. Bradley nodded, his eyes following Max as the dog gently encouraged his timid companion to venture further into the snow. Who would have thought, he mused, that losing everything would lead to finding something better? The shelter had been Jenna's idea, born during the long conversations that followed their first emotional meeting. Bradley had been determined to make amends, not just to Max once, but to all the animals who shared similar stories. His business acumen, combined with Jenna's experience in animal rescue, had created something unique, a state-of-the-art facility that focused on both physical and emotional healing for abandoned pets. The hospital approved my reduced schedule, Jenna said, smiling as Max successfully coaxed his friend into a playful bow. I can spend 3 days a week here now. She had continued her nursing career, finding that her experience with human healing complemented her work with animals in unexpected ways. Bradley's phone buzzed. These days, it was usually about shelter business rather than stock prices. A potential donor wanted to tour the facility, interested in funding their innovative rehabilitation programs. They want to see how we've managed to maintain such high adoption success rates, he said, reading the message. Maybe we should show them this, Jenna suggested, gesturing to where Max now lay in the snow, allowing a nervous rescue dog to snuggle against him for warmth. The once aloof dog had become the shelter's unofficial therapy animal, somehow knowing exactly how to approach each new arrival with the perfect balance of encouragement and respect. The sight brought a lump to Bradley's throat. He forgave me, he said quietly, but he chose to stay with you. That's when I knew I had to change. The memory of that night still haunted him, Max's gentle acceptance of his presence, but clear preference for his new home with Jenna. Instead of fighting for custody, Bradley had proposed a different solution. He sold his controlling shares in his investment firm, using the capital to create Max's haven. The shelter became his way of honoring the lesson Max had taught him about love and loyalty. We all chose each other, Jenna corrected him, reaching for his hand. Their relationship had evolved slowly, built on shared dedication to their mission and the gradual recognition that their different perspectives created something stronger together. Max knew what he was doing all along. As if hearing his name, Max looked up from his snowy companion, his tail wagging at the sight of his two favorite humans together. He had full run of the shelter grounds, but chose to spend his nights at Jenna's apartment, with regular visits to Bradley's new, more modest home nearby. The shelter's front bell chimed, announcing visitors, a family looking to adopt, their children's excited voices carrying through the reception area. Bradley squeezed Jenna's hand before letting go. They had work to do, more hearts to heal, more connections to forge. Time to show them how second chances work, he said, straightening his jacket, no longer an armor against emotion, but a simple matter of professionalism. Jenna nodded, already moving to greet the family, her natural warmth drawing the children's immediate attention. Max trotted over to join them, snow clinging to his golden fur. He had become an expert at reading potential adopters, his presence often helping nervous families or hesitant dogs feel more at ease. Bradley watched as his former pet, now his greatest teacher, demonstrated once again the incredible capacity of the heart to heal, to forgive, and to love without conditions. Outside, the snow continued to fall on Chicago, covering the city in a blanket of renewal. Within the walls of Max's haven, countless stories of transformation unfolded daily, each one a testament to the power of understanding, patience, and the willingness to choose love over fear. Bradley Wilkinson, once known as the Ice King of Wall Street, had found his true calling in the warm chaos of rescue work. His spreadsheets now tracked rehabilitation progress instead of profit margins, and his negotiations focused on matching the right families with their perfect companions. In losing everything he thought he wanted, he had gained everything he never knew he needed. As the winter day softened into evening, Max made his usual rounds of the shelter. Checking on his nervous friend one last time before heading home with Jenna, Bradley watched them go, his heart full with the knowledge that sometimes the greatest acts of love involve letting go, and the deepest bonds are formed when we have the courage to begin again. Dear listeners, we hope Max's story of transformation and redemption has touched your hearts. This tale of unexpected connections and second chances reminds us that true love often finds us in the most surprising ways. If you'd like to experience more emotional journeys like this one, click the subscribe button below. Don't forget to leave a like and share your own stories of redemption in the comments. Remember, every day brings new opportunities for transformation and healing. Join us tomorrow for another touching story that explores the depths of the human heart. We're waiting to hear your thoughts in the comments.